Knowledge is as wings to man's life and a ladder for his ascent. It is through knowledge that man is enabled to attain perfection. Baha'u'llah. The education and training of the mind is like the cultivation of a garden. It must be carefully tended so that science and spiritual truth work together. Abdul Baha. Who is it that can imagine the lofty standard which such a civilization, as it unfolds itself, is destined to attain? Who can measure the heights to which human intelligence, liberated from its shackles, will soar? Shoghi Effendi. So our speaker today is Mr. Alan Smith, and his topic is AI through the eye of a Baha'i, and this is part two. Mr. Alan Smith, a Baha'i since the early 1970s, has served as a member of the local and national spiritual assemblies in the Virgin Islands and the Continental Board of Counsellors for the Americas from 1985 to 1995. In 1976, he and his family relocated to St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands, where he was employed as a lawyer in both the public and private sectors, a government department head, and in 2013 retired from government service as a magistrate judge in the Superior Court. So with that, I'll hand it off to Mr. Smith.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome back. It's a pleasure to be here again. We've had some technical glitches, but I hope we can overcome them as we move forward in an easy way. And science and religion work together, but sometimes it's problematic. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the Baha'i Faith, I just wanted to give a brief overview. The Baha'i Faith is the world's most recent independent and global religion. Its founder, Baha'u'llah, announced his revelation in 1863, and he was preceded by one that we refer to as the Bab, or the Gate, in 1844, who announced the coming of one whom God shall make manifest, the promised one of all ages, whom Baha'is believe to be Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah brought three primary teachings: the oneness of God, the oneness of religion, and the oneness of humanity. And so the effort of all Baha'is around the world is to spread those teachings as best we can. And the Baha'i Faith has no clergy, but it has an administrative order with local spiritual assemblies in communities where there are 9 or more believers, national spiritual assemblies at national levels, and then the Universal House of Justice, which is the guiding and international body of the Baha'i Faith. And all of those institutions are elected by believers and or delegates selected by believers without nomination or any sort of electioneering. The faith is now spread in virtually every country of the world. And following the passing of Baha'u'llah, his son Abdul Baha, whom we refer to as the center of the covenant, was responsible for guiding the affairs of the faith. And following his passing in 1921, his grandson, whom we refer to as the guardian of the faith, Shoghi Effendi, was responsible for basically building the infrastructure, if you will, of the global Baha'i community that we have today. And following his passing, the first Universal House of Justice, our international governing body, was elected in 1963. So it's kind of that's the brief history and the structure of our faith. And you can find out information about the Baha'i Faith in more detail at www.baha'i.org, the official website of the Baha'i community globally. So In last week's session, we explored the act of naming and how it reveals worldwide and how the phrase artificial intelligence emerged from a particular understanding of the human mind. And hopefully it stimulated your thinking about artificial intelligence from my perspective, just the perspective of one individual Baha'i. There are others, of course. Personally, there was at least one person who it stimulated, and that person shared with me a very interesting article on the use of AI in support of the elderly. It was an article that appeared in the New York Times. If my technical issues hadn't arisen, my plan was to post that in the chat. Unfortunately, I can't do it. I do want to thank the individual who sent the article, because that article influenced significantly the direction of today's presentation. So, and what that article did, it raised a question. And the question flowed from the previous conversation that we had. And the question for me was, if we learn to name our artificial intelligence tools correctly or rightly, can we also learn how to use them to advance justice, unity, and service? So that sparked me to decide to share with you my personal journey thus far with the use of artificial intelligence, most specifically ChatGPT. And then also to share with you some thoughts. And again, because of some technical issues, I wanted to be able to put it up so it could be seen, but it's a one page, some guidelines for Baha'is who want to engage with artificial intelligence. So my journey began probably in the same way that it did for many of you. Mine began at about age 77 or 78. And that engagement left me feeling both fear and curiosity. Fear in the sense that much of the media at that time it had kind of gone to looking at AI as more of a threat to human beings and our well-being, rather than as a tool that we could use for learning and improving the quality of our lives. And it continues to this day, and perhaps even in a more strident way, to be seen on the negative side in the media. So one day while I was reading the writings, I remembered one of Baha'u'llah's teachings about the fear of God. And Baha'u'llah says, the fear of God is the weapon that can render him victorious, the primary instrument whereby he can achieve his purpose. And he goes on to say, and that which guardeth and restraineth both man, both inwardly and outwardly, have been and still is the fear of God. It's man's true protector and his spiritual guardian. These words on that day struck me deeply and in a new way. For in that moment, I tasted the reality that there is nothing in the created world that I should fear. Why should I be afraid of something named, quote, artificial intelligence? It was this realization that allowed me to confront my fear and AI and learn how to make it a tool for my spiritual and intellectual maturation. Baha'u'llah has said that humanity is moving now from its adolescence to its maturity. And as a mature individual, and as one who is trying to put into practice Baha'u'llah's teaching that fear of God is my protector and it's my guardian, then I should go about experiencing and experimenting with AI. So it started with ChatGPT, and I've limited my interaction with AI to ChatGPT at this time. My efforts were focused not on getting answers, but on asking better questions. And I think that comes to me from my background in the legal profession, because one of the things that, particularly if you're a trial lawyer, it's essential, is your ability to ask the right question at the right time in order to establish the evidence that you wish to have established in the case, or to accentuate the argument that you want to make at a particular time. So I began looking at passages from the Baha'i writings about unity, justice, and consultation, and considering how they might apply in an emerging digital world. Fortunately, the Universal House of Justice has provided some guidance on that. And essentially what I did surprised me in that I reached the conclusion that it was not the technology itself, but what it revealed about my own thinking. And it could become like a mirror and reflect back to me what I was thinking, and allow me then to reflect even more deeply on what I might have thought about the writings, how I may have understood them, and then reconsider my understanding. And in that way, refine my appreciation and understanding of the writings. So, for instance, one of the things that I looked at was, in the writings, we find frequently the term remember or remembrance. Now, typically, remembering, we think in terms of the memory, right? I remember this, I remember that, etc. But for human beings, remembrance is something more than storing and retrieving data. And while machines can do that and preserve that information in large quantities and with remarkable speed, remembrance from the Baha'i perspective has to do with more than mere recall. It's the orientation of my heart at every moment. What is the focus of my attention? Remembrance, is it drawing closer to God? If it's drawing closer to God, then I can use a host of different tools to gain greater knowledge, greater insights, etc. So, again, I want to repeat that from my understanding, fear of God is an orientation of my heart. And so to remember God is to align my will and perceptions with truth as revealed by Baha'u'llah, and to allow my actions to reflect the higher principles contained in Baha'u'llah's writing. One of the things that digital systems do is they tend to preserve and fragment knowledge. They, like the AI and so forth, they recognize patterns, but they recognize patterns as fragments of information, and then they then have the ability to bring together these different fragments and create a pattern that is useful to us. And that's a very excellent tool, yet without my heart being in this state of remembrance, in this orientation toward God, I may not be seeking coherence, meaning, and moral direction. And technical memory can expand our capacity, but only spiritual remembrance can shape our character and ensure that expanding power serves justice, unity, and the common good rather than fragmentation of self interest. So gradually it became apparent that artificial intelligence should be understood not as a replacement of human intelligence, as some people now fear, but as a tool that can expand our capacity for consultation and collective learning. So in my view, it's really about how we as human beings can learn to think together more deeply, guided by spiritual principles, at a time when the world urgently needs unity, and use these machines, use AI as a tool for achieving that outcome. We are responsible for building this structure. So I just wanted to open with that comment. At the outset, the song talked about the harmony of science and religion. And the harmony of science and religion must be guided by spiritual principles. Technology must remain the servant of humanity, not its master. The challenge before humanity then, in my view, is not whether AI is good or bad. The question is whether we will guide it with justice, compassion, and unity. So there are a couple of quotes from the Bahá'í writings that I think help us reflect a little bit more deeply on this. One is from Baha'u'llah and the other from Abdul Baha. Baha'u'llah says, "The essence of all that we have revealed for thee is justice." And Abdul Baha said that God made religion and science to be the measure of our understanding. Justice, as used by Baha'u'llah, perhaps has a far deeper meaning than the way that we typically use that word. People typically use that word in the sense of whether or not someone or somebody or whether I have been treated fairly. Yet Baha'u'llah implies that justice is something more than that, something deeper than that, having to do with the way that I perceive the world generally and perceive myself and others in relation to the world, the equity. And Abdul Baha says that both science and religion can be measures of our understanding of the world that we live in. The article that I referenced at the outset basically shows how an AI robot helped to alleviate the loneliness of a woman. It gave her support. It enhanced her dignity. It gave her actually a personal companion. So that raised also a whole host of questions. If people can get that kind of companionship from a robot, do we need other human beings? Well, the article, the journalist who wrote the article writes it in such a way that the interaction with the AI, with the robot, actually increased in certain ways the quality of her interaction with her family and friends. And I think it's worth reading in order to appreciate that. So within our own Baha'i communities, then, how is it that we might be able to increase the cohesion and unity and collaboration and cooperation and intimacy with members of our immediate family, with members of our Baha'i family, with members of our wider community, and the world? At the same time, we must be honest. Many of the current AI systems are shaped by commercial models that aim to capture attention, influence desire, and increase consumption. This reflects the broader values of the global economic system in which they arise. The Baha'i teachings don't reject material progress, but they insist that it be guided by justice, moderation, and service to the common good. Like when someone says, "Oh, I'm sorry," and immediately changes the subject, we often feel that something is missing. There's some authenticity missing. And AI, of course, tends to do the same thing when it gets you scrolling down, right? It's constantly changing the subject to something else. And yet the difference between that constant inauthenticity that you might say is present and how we interact with other people is that the machine does not change on its own. Human beings still possess the capacity to awaken, to be more conscious, to reflect, and to grow in compassion, to grow at the level of the heart. Machines don't have this capacity. Even if they respond, they're not responding because the machine has made a conscious decision to respond, but it's been programmed to respond in a particular way. And it cannot really feel love or presence or sacrifice the way that human beings can actually feel those emotions. It may simulate empathy, but not experience loss, love, or moral responsibility. The challenge before humanity is not whether machines will become human, but whether human beings will become more deeply human in an age of powerful tools. I'd like for us just to reflect a moment, and if you want to put in your chat something related to what's been said so far, and what's going to be read, feel free to do so. 3 questions. What distinguishes genuine compassion from simulation? How do we remain deeply human in an age of powerful tools? How might spiritual insight guide scientific progress? It's fair also to ask the question, what happens when humans learn to think, consult, and act together at higher levels? The teachings of Baha'u'llah point toward collective decision-making, global unity, and consultation as a source of wisdom. So as we reflect and put our comments, thoughts, and ideas in the chat, I'd like perhaps for us to think about this as a consultative relationship. I don't have answers to questions. I'm surfacing questions, but each one of you has to discover, each one of us has to discover the answers and make application of them in our lives. So I'd like to close with the following reflection again. What principles should guide the development and use of AI? How can technology strengthen unity and service? Where do we see opportunities for AI to uplift our community? Or where do you see opportunities for it to uplift your community? And finally, what principles should, and as we consider these questions or think about these questions or ideas related to these questions, there are some more quotes, and again, 4 more, and I know it's difficult to keep track of them without them being showed, but this, of course, points out the limits of technology. When something goes wrong, right now in the Virgin Islands, we're experiencing a power outage, which means I was unable to upload certain information between my phone and my laptop and get it to Bayan. But I'll read these again. I'll read them slowly so you can perhaps take them in. You may recall them from your own reading and then use them as points of reflection. Man is the supreme talisman. Lack of a proper education hath, however, deprived him of that which he doth inherently possess. Baha'u'llah. The reality of man is his thought, not his material body. The thought force and the animal force are partners. Abdul Baha. Man is organic with the world. His inner life molds the environment and is itself also deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of man is the result of these mutual reactions. And finally, the enormous energy dissipated and wasted on war will be consecrated to such ends as the extension of scientific research, the sharpening and refinement of the human brain, the furtherance of any other agency that can stimulate the intellectual, the moral, and spiritual life of the entire human race. Shoghi Effendi. So thanks again for listening. I'll turn back over to Bayan for the Q&A, and perhaps we can make this Q&A more of a contribution session for our own learning about AI. There was a little AI guide that had been put together, but unfortunately, again, technology prevented us from being able to share it with you today.
Thank you, Mr. Smith, for this part two. I think all these principles of justice, and it gets us really thinking. So if anyone has any, like you said, contributions or questions, you can put them in the chat and I will read them out. I have one contribution I guess I could make. I was thinking about your question about what distinguishes real compassion from simulation, and I was thinking it might be sacrifice, because when someone is compassionate towards you, I think they're sacrificing or they're doing something selflessly, whereas a simulation of compassion doesn't involve any aspect of sacrifice. We have another comment. AI orients towards the past and reiterating that past into the present. The human mind orients towards a new and more advanced future. It doesn't just tread the beaten path of the past, but is constantly evaluating the present in terms of the immediate needs of the moment. Present needs are constantly evolving and never repeat.
Excellent observation. Excellent observation.
I have a question. When you use artificial intelligence to guide your study of the writings or research, how do you distinguish between what it produces that might be, made up or hallucinated versus what is true? Because I know sometimes when I've used it, it sometimes creates its own writings and it attributes it to Baha'u'llah or something.
One of the ways that I have attempted to deal with that is I upload the writings. And I have established in my interaction with ChatGPT what is called truth testing. So anything that ChatGPT says to me, I then ask ChatGPT to truth test it against the authentic text of the writings. And because ChatGPT doesn't have any independent mind, right? It's going to, what it may have given me back that may have been hallucination, if you will, then gets bounced up against the precise text of the writing, and it will correct. It will come back with a more accurate reflection. In fact, it may come back with the writings verbatim, and it will even say back to you, I was incorrect. That's one of the things that I've done in terms of experimenting with it and using it, and in a sense demanding that it respond in accordance with, or sometimes put the actual text back into the system. and say, this is what the Baha'i writings actually say, right? And then again, truth test what comes back against what the Baha'i writings actually say.
Another question asks, do you think AI could ever possess consciousness, or is consciousness inseparable from the soul?
That's a debate right now going on in the amongst people who are more studied in it than I. Um, the soul is an essence that is incomprehensible to the human mind. That's what Baha'u'llah tells us. And if it is incomprehensible to the human mind, then inasmuch as algorithms and large language models are generated by human beings, my belief is that God alone knows the essence of the soul. And so therefore, that soul consciousness, that soul reality, cannot be replicated, if you will, by a machine, by an algorithm. If it were, then the concept of God, I think, would be eliminated, because it would have then encompassed that consciousness that is beyond our consciousness.
Another question says, since AI algorithms are written by humans, does that mean AI can contain bias?
Absolutely. I'll give you a very interesting example, again, of my testing. I was working on something and I asked AI to generate an image. And I said I wanted an image of a finger touching a circuit board. The image came back, and the hue of the skin was very light. Some of my people, it looked white. Okay. So my response back was, what made you give me that hue of skin? And AI said back to me, well, I was trained on images primarily from the West, primarily from Europe and America. When 85% of the people in the world have darker hued skin, you give me skin color that's representative of 15%. So that's a matter, again, of pressing the machine to reflect more of reality. Now, of course, if those who are in control of inputting the images are, again, limited to primarily people in the West, and the images they have available to them are images primarily in the West, then you get bias built into the algorithm in the training. At least that's my layman's view of it.
Another question asks, does AI change the meaning of work? And what does the Baha'i vision of work as worship imply here?
Every advance in technology, in my view, since the beginning, changed the meaning of work. When we were when our ancestors were primarily hunters and gatherers, work was vastly different and had vastly different meaning than it has today. So yes, it will change the meaning of work. um, in a material sense, but perhaps in a spiritual sense, it won't change the meaning, in that Abdul Baha says to us that the reason one should have an occupation is so that they can assist in carrying the burdens of those who cannot bear their own burdens. So that there may and likely will always be those in the world who cannot carry their own burden, and there will be others, the rest of the community will be responsible for helping them carry their burden. So perhaps in my mind, work perhaps becomes more oriented towards service. How am I serving the well-being of the whole? You know, the Industrial Revolution forced us into this mode of how am I serving my own personal well-being, or my own nuclear family well-being, or now even my own personal well-being. Whereas work in the future may be defined, and again, this is just simply my musings, my thoughts, as to how do I serve in such a way that the well-being of the whole community is sustained and uplifted? How do I stay in that constant state of prayer? You know, Abdul Baha says, strive that your actions day by day may become like beautiful prayers. So we may see that striving as more like becoming like beautiful prayers.
Um, One contribution tells us that there's an AI called Perplexity, and it gives authentic references that you can check. I think that's a useful tool. And then another question follow up, if these AIs are biased, then how can you trust what it gives you, and how do you select one?
You test them. That's the only thing I can say is you test them, and you test them against uh, the writings, because from my limited understanding, AI is going to give you back um, uh, what it's been taught, and if it hasn't been taught something, then it's not going to be able to give it back to you. And if it hallucinates, it's going to give you something that has no substance behind it. And it may reflect its own confusion and its own inability to process. That's my thinking on it.
Sort of similar question. Can the algorithm be influenced by the volume of input of a given topic? For example, if a billion people are writing and exploring peace and justice related articles every day, does that impact what AI says about peace when asked about the subject?
I don't know. Could be. That's a very interesting question. You know, like when the internet first went up, right? Well, let's go back to the beginning of the computer, right? The very beginning of the computer, the people who were building computers said, why would any individual want to have one of these? When the question was waste. And the guys building computers back then said, no individual person would ever want to have one of these, right? Yet we now carry around in our hands devices that have more computing power than the computer that was on the rocket that was sent up to the moon. So in 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 that sense, we it's only going to be limited, I think, by the degree to which we human beings can learn the deeper meanings of justice and unity, and truthfulness. And those are attributes of God that we're asked to reflect into the world to the best of our ability in every interaction that we have with those around us.
Another question says, AI will undoubtedly increasingly be able to pick up our motivations and intentions from what we input to it. This allows state surveillance. Users' motives will become clear to the state authorities. I believe this means crime will shift from overt acts to acts of knowledge manipulation, which preys on the ignorant. Can you comment on that in light of your legal background and perhaps show parallels to it in the past and present?
Great question. Great question. And there's a fundamental teaching in the Baha'i Faith that perhaps for me is necessary to come back to. Is truthfulness is the foundation of all human virtues. And this is what we as Baha'is, and this is what Baha'u'llah has laid out for me as the horizon toward which I must daily strive in every interaction. So to the degree that truthfulness is a fundamental, as the foundation of all human virtues, is infused into the institutions and structures that we build, and to the degree that it is maintained within the administrative order provided by Baha'u'llah, which the Guardian tells us is to be the pattern of the future world civilization, the likelihood will be diminished. And for me, that's the most that one might say on that topic. So that as we engage in the community building activities provided to us by the House of Justice and guided by the institutions of the faith, those efforts are all premised on truthfulness, and the truthfulness being the foundation of all human virtues. And that becomes the norm. That becomes the way in which we think. You know, there's the quote that was read from the Guardian, where the Guardian said, "Man is organic with the world. His inner life molds the environment and is itself deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of man is the result of these mutual reactions." So from my limited perspective, it's the degree to which our inner lives are transformed through the Word of God, as revealed by Baha'u'llah. That determines the environment. And as that environment is infused more deeply with truthfulness as the foundation of all human virtues, that environment then reflects back again on the individual, and individuals become increasingly more truthful.
Another interesting question asks, could AI assist in translation and dissemination of the writings globally, and what are the risks?
In my opinion, yes, and I believe the House of Justice has already indicated that it is permissible to utilize AI for translation. However, those are to, under all circumstances, be reviewed by human beings, and never to be relied upon exclusive, or not to be relied upon exclusively as the correct and appropriate, translation, if you will.
Thank you. Can reliance on AI weaken the independent investigation of truth?
Great question. In my view, it can weaken it only if the individual user allows it to weaken it. If so, my comments earlier were that my effort to use AI was to ask better questions. And by asking better questions, it then can become a more efficient instrument for learning. So one of the things that in my personal use, encountering a word in the writings, okay? And of course, Baha'u'llah says every word has 70 plus 7 meanings, right? But frequently, the meaning that I encounter in 2026 of a word may not have been the meaning of that word even at the time that the Guardian translated it from Arabic or Farsi into English. It may not even have the same meaning as it had at the time the Guardian translated it in English. And then if we look at the etymology of the word itself, going back to the Latin or Greek or whatever language or the old Germanic, you may find that it was derived from words that had even slightly more nuanced meanings. So, as the House of Justice says that as we work with the writings, we can not rely on the contemporary language, contemporary notions. We have a duty to look much more deeply. Let me give you an example of something that AI assisted me with. I think most of you in this space have probably heard the expression to fight fire with fire. Since I can't see you all on my screen, Bayan, can you see most everybody on the screen, or a lot of people on the screen?
Yeah.
And ask how many people. Ask people to raise their hand if they have an idea what to fight fire with fire means, and then ask one or two of them to enter the answer in the chat.
Yes. So if anyone has any ideas, we already have some hands raised. Put in the chat what you think it means to fight fire with fire. One comment is that it is when forgiveness is not present. Another one says when you use the weapons or tactics of one's enemy or opponent, even if one finds them distasteful. Another one that says using force against force, or if you are a firefighter, use it to stop the spread of fires, which is good.
Right now, it's interesting. One person touched upon the true meaning of what it means to fight fire with fire. Fire has three components: heat, fuel, and oxygen. If you remove any one of those components, you no longer have a fire. Native Americans learned that in a raging wildfire that was approaching their encampment, that if they burned the underbrush between themselves and the raging fire, it would have no fuel and the fire would go out. So it had nothing to do with tit for tat, giving as good as you get. It had to do with removing one of the essential elements necessary to sustain a fire. So for me, that's a change in the way that one might understand the use of a phrase. So for me, in thinking about that, one of the phrases that occurred to me after I encountered artificial intelligence and began experimenting with looking at artificial intelligence was perhaps the name should be augmented digital capacity. That I can augment my capacity using this digitized format of a machine. I augment my capacity. It doesn't compete with my intelligence. It doesn't substitute for my intelligence. It doesn't override my intelligence. I augment my capacity in the same way that as the Webb telescope has now augmented our capacity to look into deep space. The way that the microscope invented by van Leeuwenhoek allowed him to augment his capacity to see into a drop of water. It didn't take away his humanity. It allowed him to a greater capacity, an augmented capacity to see something he couldn't see with with the naked eye. Perhaps if we looked at it in that way, it becomes less of a threat. And we can view it more comfortably as a tool that we can learn how to work with and manage.
Another contribution is that AI is causing an inflation in knowledge, and knowledge will therefore eventually become almost worthless because most people will be informed of and will possess it, while today most people aren't. Schools will change into teaching values and virtues, which AI cannot because it cannot show a living example of them. The old world is reacting to this by confusing knowledge, by claiming everything is relative, and there can be no objective knowledge we can hold on to, i.e., false news. As Baha'is, we know that we can only combat that view by building community and strengthening the spiritual basis of our individual, community, and institutional life and workings. What strategies do you recommend for this?
Fantastic. Appreciate that very much. And that shapes us, in my view, right where we need to be. And that is doing what it is that the House of Justice asks us to do in every community. So that this unfoldment is accelerated. All of the instruments that we've been given through the guidance from the House of Justice and the Teaching Center is designed and intended to open and accelerate the pace at which this fundamental spiritual reality is revealed to each person on earth, where we begin to understand, as we understand in Book 1, that true life is the life of the Spirit. And that life of the Spirit is manifest what? In Book 1? Through service. First, with the simple service of learning how to share a prayer with someone. And ultimately, as that environment grows, it begins then to react upon the individual. And we begin to see individuals behaving differently with respect to themselves and to others. In book one, beware, all ye people of Baha, lest ye prefer yourself before your neighbor. We begin to move toward that world where no one would want for anything, because my first consideration would be you and not myself. This is the condition that Baha'u'llah, at least from my limited understanding, says that each soul is endowed with potentially. But education is essential, fundamentally spiritual education as well as material education.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions? Well, it looks like those were all our questions, and we have some thanks in the chat for this enlightening talk, and I want to thank you as well. I think this is a topic that we should all be thinking about, and what you said is true. I think artificial intelligence can augment our tools and our powers and help us, serve Baha'u'llah and the faith even more effectively, as long as we, take care not to replace thinking for us, like you were describing. So, yeah.
And I want to say thank you to everyone for participating and contributing in this way where we're all learning together in this consultative mode. And it's just a bounty and a blessing to be able to participate in this, and we can continue to serve as best we can right where we are, um, and be the recipients of Baha'u'llah's ceaseless blessings and bounties, and swimming in the ocean of his grace and love. So thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you. Our speaker next week is going to be Mrs. Sima Khodrati, and her topic is The Inner Child and the Journey of the Soul, a Baha'i Perspective. And again, these talks are every Saturday at noon Eastern time, so you can invite your friends and family. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list where we send out the invitations for these talks, you can fill out the Google form that I will put in the Zoom chat and the YouTube description box. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you all next Saturday. Have a great week. Bye.